chapters 50, 51, and 52 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 50, Aristocracy and Democracy, discusses the idea of superior classes and races, and whether there is a natural basis for such a doctrine. In the letters of Thomas Jefferson is found the following passage: "All eyes are open or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God." This, which Jefferson, over 100 years ago, described as a palpable truth, is still a long way from prevailing in the world. We are trying in this book not to take anything for granted, so we do not assume this truth, but investigate it, and we begin by admitting that there are many facts which seem to contradict it, and which make it more difficult of proof than Jefferson realized. It is not enough to point out the lack of saddles on the backs and of boots and spurs on the feet of newly born infants, for the fact is that men are not exploited because of saddles, nor is the exploiting accomplished by means of boots and spurs. It is done by means of gold and steel, banks and credit system, railroads, machine guns and battleships. And while it is not true that certain races and classes are born with these things on them, they are born to the possession of them, and the vast majority of mankind are without them all their lives, and without the ability to use them, even if they had them. The doctrine that all men are created equal, or that they ought to be equal, we shall describe for convenience as the democratic doctrine. It first came to general attention through Christianity, which proclaimed the brotherhood of all mankind in a common fatherhood of God. But even as taught by the Christians, the doctrine had startling limitations. It was several centuries before church councils summoned the courage to decide that women were human beings and had souls. And today many devout Christians are still uncertain whether Japanese and Chinese and Filipinos and Negroes are human beings and have souls. I have heard old gentlemen in the South gravely maintain that the Negro is not a human being at all, but a different species of animal. I have heard learned men in the South set forth that the sutures in the Negro skull close at some very early age, and thus make moral responsibility impossible for the black race. And you will find the same ideas maintained not merely as to differences of race and color, but as to differences of economic condition. You will find the average aristocratic Englishman quite convinced that the lower orders are permanently inferior to himself, and this though they are of the same Anglo-Saxon stock. For convenience, I will refer to the doctrine that there is some natural and irremovable inferiority of certain races or classes as the aristocratic doctrine. I will probably startle some of my readers by making the admission that if there is any such natural or irremovable inferiority, then a belief in political or economic equality is a blunder. If there are certain classes or races which cannot think or cannot learn to think as well as other classes and races, those mentally inferior classes and races will obey, and they will be made to obey. And neither you nor I, nor all the preachers and agitators in the world will ever be able to arrange it otherwise. Suppose we could do it. We should be committing a crime against life. We should be holding down the race and aborting its best development. Is there any such natural and irremovable inferiority in human beings? When we come to study the question, we find it complicated by a different phenomenon, that of racial immaturity, which we have to face frankly and get clear in our minds. One of the most obvious facts of nature is that of infancy and childhood. We have just pointed out that if you are competing with a child, you do it in an entirely different way and under an entirely different set of rules, and if you fail to do this, you are unfair and even cruel to the child. And it is a fact of our world that there are some races more backward in the scale of development than other races. You may not like this fact, but it is silly to try to evade it. People who live in savage huts and beat on tom-toms and fight with bows and arrows and cannot count beyond a dozen. Such people are not the mental or moral equals of our highly civilized races, and to treat them as equals and compete with them on that basis means simply to exterminate them. And we should either exterminate them at once and be done with it, or else make up our minds that they are in a childhood stage of our race, and that we have to guide them and teach them as we do our children. There is no more useful person than the wise and kind teacher. But suppose we saw someone pretending to be a teacher to our children, while in reality enslaving and exploiting them, or secretly robbing and corrupting them. What would we say about that kind of teacher? The name of that teacher is capitalist commercialism, and his profession is known as the white man's burden. His abuse of power is the cause of our present racial wars and revolts of subject peoples. A fair-minded man, desirous of facing all the facts of life, hardly knows what stand to take in such a controversy. That is, hardly knows from which cause the colored races suffer more, the white man's exploitation or their own native immaturity. To say that certain races are in a childhood stage and need instruction and discipline is an entirely different thing from saying that they are permanently inferior and incapable of self-government. Whether they are permanently inferior is a problem for the man of science, to be determined by psychological tests, continued possibly over more than one generation. We have not as yet made a beginning. In fact, we have not even acquired the scientific impartiality necessary to such an inquiry. In the meantime, all that we can do is to look about us and pick up hints where we can. In places like Massachusetts, where Negroes are allowed to go to college and are given a chance to show what they can do, they have not ousted the white man, but many of them have certainly won his respect, and one finds charming and cultured men among them who show no signs of prematurely closed-up skulls. And one after another we see the races which have been held down as being inferior developing leadership and organization and power of moral resistance. The Irish are showing themselves today one of the most vigorous and high-spirited of all races. The Hindus are developing a movement which, in the long run, may prove more powerful than the white man's gold and steel. The Egyptians, the Persians, the Filipinos, the Koreans are all devising ways to break the power of capitalist newspaper censorship. How sad that the subject races of the world have to get their education through hatred of their teachers instead of through love. Of course, these rebel leaders are men who have absorbed the white man's culture, at least in part. Practically always, they are of the younger generation, which has been to the white man's schools. But this is the very answer we have been seeking, as to whether the race is permanently inferior or merely immature and in need of training. It is not only among the brown and black and yellow races that progress depends upon the young generations. That is a universal fact of life. In the course of this argument, we shall assume that the Christian or democratic theory has the weight of probability on its side, and that nature has not created any permanently and necessarily inferior race or class. We shall assume that the heritage of culture is a common heritage, open to all our species. We shall not go so far as the statement which Jefferson wrote into the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created free and equal, but we shall assert that they are created with certain inalienable rights, and that among these is the right to maintain their lives and to strive for liberty and happiness. Also, we shall say that there will never be peace or order in the world until they have found liberty and recognition of their right to happiness. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51. Ruling Classes. Deals with authority in human society, how it is obtained, and what sanction it can claim. It is possible to conceive an order of nature in which all individuals were born and developed exactly alike and with exactly equal powers. Such is apparently the case with lower animals, for example the ants and bees. But among human beings there are great differences. Some are born idiots, and some are born geniuses. Even supposing that we are able to do away with blindness and idiocy, it is not likely that we can ever make a race of uniform genius. There will always be some more capable minds who will discover new powers of life, and will compel the others to learn from them. It is to the interest of the race that this learning should be done as quickly as possible. In other words, the great problem of society is how to recognize superior minds and put them in authority. We look back over history and discover a few wise men and many rulers, but very, very rarely does it happen that the ruler is a wise man, or a friend of wise men. Far more often we find the ruler occupied in suppressing the wise man and his wisdom. There was a ruler who allowed the mob to crucify Jesus, and another who ordered Socrates to drink the hemlock, and another who tortured Galileo, and another who chopped off the head of Sir Walter Raleigh, and so on through a long and tragic chronicle. And even when the accident of a wise ruler occurs, he is apt to be surrounded by a class of parasites and corrupt officials who are busy to thwart his will. The general run of history is this: some group seizes power by force and holds it by the same means, and seeks to augment and perpetuate it. Those who win the power are frequently men of energy and practical sense, and do fairly well as governors. But they are never able to hand on their virtues, and their line becomes corrupted by sensuality and self-indulgence, and the subject classes are plundered and driven to revolt. Often the revolt fails, but in the course of time it succeeds, and there is a new dynasty or a new ruling class, sometimes a little better than the old, sometimes worse. How shall one judge whether the new regime is better or worse? Obviously, this is a most important question. It has to do not merely with history, but with our daily affairs, our voting. As one who has read some tens of thousands of pages of history, and has pondered its lessons with heart sickness and despair, I lay down this general law by which revolts and changes of power may be judged. If the change results in the holding of power by a smaller number of people, it is a reaction. But if the change results in distributing the power among a larger group of the community, then that community has made a step in advance. I have seen a sketch of the history of some Central American country, Guatemala, I think, which showed 130 revolutions in less than 100 years. Some rascal gets together a gang and seizes the government and plunders its revenue. When he has plundered too much, some other rascal stirs up the people and gets together another gang. Such revolutions we regard as subjects for comic opera and for the Richard Harding Davis type of fiction, but we do not consider them as having any relationship to progress. We describe them as palace revolutions. But compare with this the various English revolutions. We write learned histories about them and describe England as the mother of parliaments. The reason for this is that when there was political discontent in England, the protesting persons proceeded to organize themselves and to understand their trouble and to remedy it. They had the brain power to do this. They maintained their right to do it, and when by violence or threats of violence they forced the ruling class to give way, they brought about a wider extension of liberty, a wider distribution of power. Tennyson has pictured England as a state where freedom slowly broadens down from precedent to precedent. We today, reading its history, are inclined to put a sarcastic emphasis on the word slowly. But Tennyson would answer that it is better for a community to move forward slowly than to move forward rapidly and then move backward nearly as far. We have pointed out several times the important fact of biology, that change does not necessarily mean progress from any rational or moral point of view. Degeneration is just as real a fact as progress, and it does not at all follow that because things change, they are changing for the better. It is worthwhile to repeat this in discussing human society, for it is just as true of governments and morals as of living species. A nation may pile up wealth and multiply 100-fold the machinery of wealth production, and only be increasing luxury and wantonness and graft. A nation may change its governmental forms, its laws and social conventions, and boast noisily of these changes in the name of progress, while, as a matter of fact, it is following swiftly the road to ruin, which all the empires of history have traced. So far as I can discover, there is one test and only one by which you can judge, and that is the test already indicated. Is the actual effective power of the state wielded by a larger or a smaller percentage of the population than before the change took place? You will note the words actual effective power. Nothing is more familiar in human life than for forms to survive after the spirit which created them is dead. And nothing is more familiar than the use of these forms as masks to deceive the populace. There have been many times in history when people have gone on voting long after their votes ceased to count for anything. There have been many times when people have gone through the motions of freedom long after they have been slaves. Mexico, under Diaz, had one of the most perfect of constitutions, and was in reality one of the most perfect of despotisms. And we Americans are sadly familiar with political democracies which do not work. Shall we, therefore, join the pessimists and say that history is a blind struggle for useless power, and that the notion of progress is a delusion? I do not think so. On the contrary, I think it is easily to be demonstrated that there has been a steady increase in the amount of knowledge possessed by the race, and in the spread of this knowledge among the whole population. I think that through most of the period of written history, we can trace a real development in human society. I think we can analyze the laws of this development and explain its methods. And I think this knowledge is precious to us because it enables us to accelerate the process and to make the end more certain. This task, the analysis of social evolution, is the task we have next to undertake. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52. The process of social evolution discusses the series of changes through which human society has passed. We have now to consider briefly the history of man as a social being, the groups he has formed, and the changes in his group systems. Everything in life grows, and human societies are no exception to the rule. They have undergone a long process of evolution, which we can trace in detail, and which we find conforms exactly to the law laid down by Herbert Spencer, a process whereby a number of single and similar things become different parts of one complex thing. In the case of human societies, the units are men and women, and social evolution is a process whereby a small and simple group, in which the individuals are practically alike, grows into a large and complex group, in which the individuals are widely different, and their relations one to another are complicated and subtle. There are two powerful forces pressing upon human beings and compelling them to struggle and grow. The first of these forces is fear, the need of protection against enemies. The second is hunger, the need of food and the means of producing and storing food. The first causes the individual to combine with his fellows and establish some form of government, and this is the origin of political evolution. The second causes him to accumulate wealth and to combine industrially, and this is the origin of economic evolution. Because the first force is a little more urgent, we observe in the history of human society that evolution in government precedes evolution in industry. I made the statement some 20 years ago in an article in Collier's Weekly. I wrote to the effect that man's first care was to secure himself against his enemies, and that when he had done this, he set out to secure his food supply. Collier's called upon the late Professor Sumner of Yale University, a prize reactionary and Tory of the old school, to answer me. And Professor Sumner made merry over my statement, declaring that man sought for food long before he was safe from his enemies. Some years later, when Sumner died, one of his admirers wrote in the New York Evening Post that he had completely overwhelmed me, and I had acknowledged my defeat by failing to reply. Something which struck me as very funny. It was, of course, possible that Sumner had overwhelmed me, but to say that I had considered myself overwhelmed was to attribute to me a degree of modesty of which I was wholly incapable. As a matter of fact, I had had my usual experience with capitalist magazines. Collier's Weekly had promised to publish my rejoinder to Sumner, but failed to keep the promise. And finally, when I worried them, they tucked the answer away in the back part of the paper, among the advertisements of cigars and toilet soaps. Professor Sumner is gone, but he has left behind him an army of pupils, and I will protect myself against them by phrasing my statement with extreme care. I do not mean to say that man first secures himself completely against his enemies, and then goes out to hunt for a meal. Of course he has to eat while he is countering the moves of his enemies. He has to eat while he is on the march to battle, or in flight from it. But ask yourself this question: which would you choose if you had to choose? To go a couple of days with nothing to eat, or to have your throat cut by bandits and your wife and children carried away into slavery? Certainly you would do your fighting first, and meantime you would scratch together any food you could. While you were devoting your energies to putting down civil war, or to making a treaty with other tribes, or to preparing for a military campaign, you would continue to get food in the way your ancestors had got it. In other words, your economic evolution would wait, while your political evolution proceeded. But when you had succeeded in putting down your enemies, and had a long period of peace before you, then you would plant some fields and domesticate some animals, or perhaps discover some new way of weaving cloth, and so your industrial life would make progress. It is easy to see why Professor Sumner wished to confuse this issue. He could not deny political evolution, because it had happened. He despised and feared political democracy, but it was here, and he had to speak politely to it as to a tiger that had got into the house. But industrial democracy was a thing that had not yet happened in the world. It was only a hope and a prophecy, and therefore a prize old Tory was free to ridicule it. I remember reading somewhere his statement, "The notion that democracy had anything to do with industry, or could in any way be applied to industry, was a piece of silliness." So, of course, he sought to demolish my idea that there was a process of evolution in economic affairs, paralleling the process of political evolution which had already culminated in democracy. Let us consider the process of political evolution briefly and in its broad outlines. Take any savage tribe. You find it composed of individuals who are very much alike. Some are a little stronger than others, a little more clever, more powerful in battle, but the difference is slight. And when the tribe chooses someone to lead them, they might as well choose one man as another. They all have a say in the tribe councils, both men and women. Their rights in the tribe are the same. They are, of course, slaves to ignorance, to degrading superstition and absurd taboos. But these things apply to everyone alike. There is no privileged caste, no hereditary inequality. But little by little, as the tribe grows in numbers and in power and intelligence, as it comes to capture slaves in battle and to unite with other tribes, there comes to be an hereditary chieftain and a group of his leading supporters, his courtiers and henchmen. When the society has evolved into the stage which we call barbarism, there is a permanent superior caste. There are hereditary priests, who have in their keeping the favor of the gods, and there is a subject population of slaves. The society moves on into the feudal stage, in which the various grades and classes are precisely marked off, each with its different functions, its different privileges and rights and duties. The feudal principalities and duchies war and struggle among themselves. They are united by marriage or by conquest, and presently some stronger ruler brings a great territory under his power, and we have what is called a kingdom, a society still larger, still more complex in its organization, and still more rigid in its class distinctions. Take France under the ancient regime, and compare a courtier or noble gentleman with a serf. They are not only different before the law, they are different in the language they use, in the clothes they wear, in the ideas they hold. They are different even in their bodies, so that the gentleman regards the serf as an inferior species of creature. The kings warred among themselves, and emperors arose. The ultimate ideal in Europe was a political society which should include the whole continent, and this idea was several times almost attained. But it is the rule of history that wherever a society is built upon the basis of privilege and enslavement, the ruling classes prove morally and intellectually unequal to the burden put upon them. They become corrupted, and their rule becomes intolerable. This happened in Europe, and there came political revolutions, first in England, which accomplished it by gradual stages, and then in the French monarchy, and quite recently in a dozen monarchies and empires, large and small. What precisely is this political revolution? Let us consider the case of France, where the change was sudden and the issues precisely drawn. King Louis XIV had said, "I am the state." To a person of our time, that might seem like boasting, but it was merely an assertion of the existing political fact. King Louis was the state by universal consent, and by divine authority, as all men believed. The army was his army, the navy was his navy, and wars, when he made them, were his wars. Everyone in the state was his subject, and all the property of the state was his personal private property, to dispose of as he pleased. The government officials carried out his will, and members of the nobility held the land and ruled in his name. But now suddenly the people of France overthrew the king and put him to death, and drove the nobles into exile. They seized the power of the French state, and proclaimed themselves equal citizens in the state, with equal voices in its government, and equal rights before the law. So we call France a republic, and describe this form of society as political democracy. It is the completion of the process of political evolution, and you will see that it moves in a sort of spiral, having completed a circle and got back to where it was before, but upon a higher plane. The citizens of a modern republic are equal before the law, just as were the members of the savage tribe. But the political organization is vastly larger and infinitely more complicated, and every individual lives his life upon a higher level, because he shares in the benefits of this more highly organized and more powerful. End of chapter 52.